Thanks for that, David, because I mean, and I'm constantly, when I come across these theoretical ideas, I'm trying to use them to understand, say, what's happening now and their enduring relevance. How, some of the many characteristics that you identified of the mass strike, as Rosa Luxemburg thinks of them. Uh, I can see, glimpses of them when we think of the protests around the Citizenship Amendment Act in India towards the end of last year. The way in which it was conducted, I mean, there was no centralized action, and new assemblies came up. People who had not been to protest before, they turn up, and then they took ownership of this neighborhood to the point that the police or the state could not get them to move. I mean, eventually, what it really took to essentially, in a sense, cause a rupture in that energy was the coronavirus pandemic. That's what's really brought an end in some ways to that phase, and we don't know what happens next. And there were, it was filled with this chaotic energy, and we weren't really sure of the political direction of it, but it was this sustained response to what you'd say this almost ridiculous oppression from the state, and it was a response to that. So that thinking of the mass strike, of how Rosa talks about it, is maybe a way to also make sense of say something that's happened in India recently. Uh, but I'd also like to learn from you. Obviously, Rosa Luxemburg eventually meets a tragic end. I mean, she dies young. She's assassinated at the age of 48. And what lessons politically, but also in terms of thinking through some of her ideas and how they are then received later on. What lessons do you think we can derive from that episode, or that phase towards the end of her life, and how it all ends for her anyway? Yeah.
Right. So Rosa goes into prison in the early days of the war that breaks out in 1914. She and her collaborator, Karl Liebknecht, they both get imprisoned for their anti-war writings and speeches. And in prison, she writes a famous critique of German social democracy called the Junius pamphlet. Mm-hmm. And essentially there, she makes the case that German social democracy has now become completely complicit with war, imperialism, and capitalism. Mm-hmm. And Lenin reads that booklet and says he agrees entirely with Junius. He suspects it's Rosa, by the way. He's not absolutely sure, but he's pretty sure it's Rosa, who's Junius. And he says he absolutely agrees, except that it stops short, because the Junius pamphlet does not call for the revolutionaries in Germany to regroup into an organization or party separate from social democracy. Now, keep in mind that prior to 1914, Lenin never would have supported revolutionaries leaving the Social Democratic Party in Germany. He, like everybody else, believed that's where genuine Marxists needed to be. But Lenin, I think, saw very sharply and clearly that the betrayal of 1914, when social democratic parties the world over supported their own governments in imperialist war, that betrayal was a dividing line. And now, if you were to be effective, you needed organizational independence. Now, of course, that would have been very hard for Rosa to do in a hands-on way from prison. Mm-hmm. But perhaps there might have been ways of helping those people who were organizing in the underground, who would eventually start to wage anti-war strikes and so on, to do so. But Lenin's feeling was that an independent party had to be organized from social democracy at that point. Mm-hmm. What the capacities were in Germany is an open question worthy of debate. But they don't begin to do that until Rosa and Karl Liebknecht get out of prison in the midst of the revolution in November 1918. Within 2 months, they've launched the German Communist Party. But we might conclude from this that this launch was too late. That the one thing that Rosa didn't have, that the Bolsheviks did have in Russia, was thousands of experienced cadres who had learned to operate underground when necessary and above ground when they could. In other words, had that capacity to move back and forth as necessary, who were deeply rooted amongst the most advanced militants in the working class movement, especially in the big urban centers. And again, we have to be careful, mechanically transposing one experience to the other. Right. But I do think that it says to us that attempting to build independent revolutionary parties in the midst of a revolutionary upheaval, with very little opportunities to do deep training and organizing beforehand, is extremely risky. When we look at the wave of European revolution to begin with, in those years 1917 to 1923, say, the fact that it was only where there had been years of training a membership in struggle independently by the Bolsheviks, there was actually a successful seizure of power by the radical left. Right. I think that's important for us to try to learn from. However, a caution. The danger here is that everybody who's got a few revolutionary ideas thinks they can now set themselves up as a party.
Right.
And then we get, unfortunately, the proliferation of self-important sects.
Right.
With no roots anywhere and no mass base anywhere. I think we have to agree, and this would be in the spirit of Lenin as well as of Rosa Luxemburg, that you can't start talking of parties in any meaningful sense until you've got thousands of people coming together out of their experiences of struggle, saying that we are finding our way to converge here and form a common revolutionary organization. Prior to that, we're creating circles, groups, networks, and so on, because the self-important proclamation of parties is equally dangerous to the task of building real ones.
Okay.
And I think we need to draw that from Rosa's experience too.
Okay. So, David, Priyansh, should I add something? Or do you have something?
No, go ahead.
Okay. So, David, I have two questions related, distinct perhaps. One is the more kind of practical in terms of, so Rosa thinks about the mass strike and she's writing about the mass strike. But she's also participating in this revolutionary process, the truncated process, which eventually takes her life. So in her writings, what do we find in terms of her vision strategically as to, okay, there's the mass strike, which is this moment of rupture where there's this mass, proliferation of consciousness and self-organization. But then do we find a vision in her life, in her practice or her theorization of what comes after that? Number one.
Right.
And then number two, which is a distinct question, is that, of course, the underlying theme in what you've been saying here is about vanguard and organizing and this kind of debate, which is also there in the left, even now, and of course at that time with Lenin's what is to be done in the early 20th century, and there's this debate on the vanguard and its relation. So perhaps you could speak to one, this kind of what comes after the mass strike, and then the kind of more theoretical implications of the vanguard organization and how that relates to this long-running debate in Marxist theory and Rosa's place in it on the structure, superstructure, and the translation in Gramscian terms and the mediation between different spheres of social practice. So two distinct questions.
Right. Okay. So what comes after the mass strike? Interestingly, Rosa's practice at the time was a party building practice.
Right.
The Polish Socialist Party, whose leadership she was always a part of, even when in Germany, in the sense that she inspired some of its key analyses, because the Polish Socialist Party had really emerged as a break from the predominantly nationalist politics where the left had focused primarily on Polish independence.
Right.
Now, I actually believe on the question of national self-determination that Lenin was more accurately appropriate to the period than Rosa.
Right.
Rosa came from an oppressed nation. And as Lenin would always say, when you're in the oppressed nation, it makes sense to strike back against the hardcore nationalists. You need to emphasize socialist politics against their nationalism. But it led her to sometimes downplay the principle of national self-determination.
Right.
So, but she was in a party in 1905 when she was there. And interestingly, the Polish Socialist Party grew from a few hundred members to about 20 or 30,000 members during the mass strike. So what's really interesting is she was party building. They became the party of the most class-conscious workers in Poland in 1905, no doubt about it. So that was clearly central to her practice. Interestingly, the Soviets or workers' councils don't figure very prominently in her booklet, The Mass Strike.
Right, yeah.
And that's why when we get to 1917, she's actually somewhat confused about the Bolsheviks giving priority to the Soviets over the old call for an elected constituent assembly.
Right.
And I think she doesn't figure that out.
Okay.
That there are new forms of socialist democracy being created in the workers, soldiers, and peasants' councils.
Right.
And so that element of what comes after, that the Soviets or workers' councils began as strike councils, but they also become what Lenin will describe as institutions of dual power.
Yeah.
They actually begin to become authentic sources of working class power against the old state. And she actually, I think, comes late to that. I think that's a gap, going back to your question around what mediations are there. Because the strikes can waver. They can ebb and flow, and she was aware of that. But if you can keep the mass workers' assemblies or councils alive, then of course the mass strike can resurge because there are institutions contending for power.
Right.
And the other side of it is the problem, the issue of the party. For Rosa, we need to read the mass strike in its German political context, because it was a book written in Germany in the context of the Social Democratic Party. And so looking back on it, we can recognize that she was trying to break through the bureaucratism of a Social Democratic Party and counterposing the self-activity of the masses to that. But in other contexts, where there is no mass party yet, if we simply read it as a praise to spontaneity, we lose sight of the fact that, hang on, as I said earlier, she was a party person. She was always in parties and always building them. The contradiction was that in Germany, a certain bureaucratism had to be broken through, or else that party was going to become what it in fact did become: pro-capitalist, pro-war, pro-imperialist.
Right.
And so I think the party is always there for Rosa, but the German context sometimes means that her emphasis on spontaneity from below, breaking through the constraints of bureaucratic leaderships, can seem too one-sided.
Right.
in circumstances where we want to move from circles and networks to some more meaningful political organization.
Right. Interesting. Although, I mean, the Soviets had already started appearing in the Russian context in the 1905 uprisings, right? So that's the first time that the Soviets, and that's the kind of the dress, looking back, that's the dress rehearsal for the revolution per se afterwards. But even then, and even though Rosa participates in those uprisings, the 1905 ones, it's an interesting lacunae that, you know, those kind of forms of organizational kind of self-making and transformation don't figure, as you were saying, in her kind of more strategic vision of perhaps what comes after the mass strike. But again, of course, that's a very important point, that, you know, none of these thinkers they themselves are translating in the strong sense of the word, both linguistically and strategically, critically, what we think of as the classics. So what we think of as the classics are not set in stone, but also they are part of a living tradition rather than a fossilized tradition, and they must be, you know, understood in that sequence of a living tradition, and, you know, translated and you know, read according to that.
I think that's right. And when you get to your Lenin discussions, I think what's so interesting there is that it takes the betrayals of German social democracy,
right,
for Lenin to return to the question of the Paris Commune,
right,
a text which had really been marginalized within the European left. And then, as 1917 revolution breaks out in February, for the first time to link the Soviets, the workers' councils, back to the Paris Commune. So he brings a text back to life because the working class has brought the commune form back to life. So I think your emphasis on how we can't see these activists and thinkers as disembodied from their social historical moment and context. Very few of them understood the significance of the Soviet in 1905.
Right.
And it's only when Lenin is rereading Marx and Engels on the Paris Commune and the February Revolution breaks out, he now makes a link.
Yeah.
But the workers are giving the practice that allows him to rehabilitate a marginalized text by Marx.
Right, interesting. And also Lenin is also going back not just to Marx and Engels, but also to Hegel at that time. Right? So he's rereading the Hegel notebooks, which is, of course, something for us in our next couple of episodes, as to, you know, what impact that rereading of Hegel has on Lenin. But Priyansh, did you want to jump in here?
Just I mean, one of the final things that I wanted to add, and thanks for this really great discussion. I guess it's helped us situate Rosa, you know, among the leading Marxian thinkers. But I'm also thinking of the many afterlives of Rosa, and I'm reminded of a book that came out a few years ago, which is a graphic novel about her life called Red Rosa by this very beautiful account by its writer called Kate Evans. And I'm thinking of how she's remembered and her current stature, you know, especially when we think of these political figures, and there is a sense within me, and I could be wrong, and I have this impression that maybe in some senses that Rosa's story is not, say, told as much as it probably should be, or she's not discussed as. And I don't know whether you've like to know from David whether you've had this impression as well, and what, and if so, what you might attribute that to. Yeah.
And if I can add, because it might link or it might not link to Priyansh's question, would that be linked to her critique of the Bolsheviks after the revolution? So if you could also just briefly also mention that as to what were her debates with Lenin and the Bolshevik revolution, and then of course the afterlives that Priyansh.
Right. Yeah, so on the current reception, obviously it's wonderful to see Rosa Luxemburg being rediscovered. But every moment of rediscovery also is a recreation. And we do run a risk, certainly in North America, that because the term democratic socialism is used in such ambiguous ways right now, that Rosa becomes positioned, because of her enormous and I think appropriate insistence on socialist democracy, and I'll come back to this in a moment, there's a danger that she becomes repositioned as part of a tradition of parliamentary socialism. And she's not that. Rosa is a revolutionary to the core. It doesn't mean she's opposed to left Marxist participation in electoral politics, not at all. This can be a strategic site of socialist Marxist activism. It was even for the Bolsheviks under Tsarism. They regularly had elected delegates in the Duma when it was allowed to run candidates openly for the left. But she was not an electoralist, and she was not a parliamentarist in her strategic perspective. So Priyansh, I think that's something that I worry about at times in the reception. In terms of the debates with Lenin, there's the public one that happens after the split in the Russian movement between the so-called Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. Remember, Bolsheviks simply meant majority, Mensheviks meant minority, and Lenin had a small majority in one key vote in the Russian Social Democratic Party Congress of 1903. And therefore he declared them the majority, the Bolsheviks. What's interesting is Rosa doesn't like some of the formulations in Lenin's What Is to Be Done and his immediate post-split writings. In particular, she doesn't like the formulations which are actually taken from Karl Kautsky that seem to give priority to intellectuals. And she cautions against the idea of a vanguard that is a self-proclaimed layer of intellectuals with no meaningful roots in the working class.
And this is, just to clarify, before the Russian Revolution.
This is before the Russian Revolution. This is around 1903 and 4 that she's doing this. But in 1905, she all of a sudden discovers, when she's active in Poland, that the people to whom she's closest are the Bolsheviks. She and the Bolsheviks, including a number of meetings with Lenin over these years, Rosa and Lenin were actually very personally friendly. They resonated, they connected, they clicked with each other as people. And she increasingly starts to identify the Bolsheviks as the revolutionary fighting wing of Russian social democracy that she's in sympathy with. And so too often people go back to earlier debates and formulations as if they were set in stone. As you may recall, when Lenin, it was proposed that Lenin's collected works be published after the revolution, Lenin said, well, maybe, but what is to be done must be put in its context. Otherwise, it will misinform the new parties emerging, the new communist movement. So he was very aware of its specific context. Then in prison in 1917, Rosa writes a pamphlet called The Russian Revolution. Now, it is full of praise. She actually says that the Bolsheviks rescued the honor of international socialism. She says, in this sense, the future belongs to Bolshevism. Very often people forget the praise that is there for that movement. They have dared to use the crisis created by the war to stay true to our Marxist program of turning the imperialist war into civil war. Rosa had co-written those lines for instance.
Yeah.
But she issues a series of cautions. I think she's wrong on some and right on others.
Right.
She cautions the Bolsheviks against their program of land to the peasants.
Mm-hmm.
She believes that this will lead to agrarian capitalism in the countryside.
Right.
I think the Bolsheviks understood correctly that land to the peasants is an essential element of this being a true popular revolution. It's the fundamental demand against the landlord class.
Yeah.
And that if the European Revolution comes to the rescue of revolutionary Russia, it's not going to be difficult to build forms of cooperative farming and communal ownership of tractors and agricultural implements and so on.
Right.
So I don't think Russia's, that Rosa is right on that criticism of land to the peasants. The Bolsheviks declare the right of self-determination to every nationality that had been oppressed by Tsarism. I believe they were right to do that, and that Rosa's anti-Polish nationalism blinded her somewhat to the importance of saying, we will not preserve the Tsarist Empire. We hope that the peoples of Poland and Lithuania and so on, Latvia, that they want to stay with us in this journey towards socialism, but we will not enforce their membership in our new Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I think they were correct on that. However, when you read her cautions over democracy, they resonate powerfully today. She says over and over, be careful about using administrative expediency. Yes, the rule of the working class may sometimes be a bit messier. It may be not as efficient in terms of the decision-making process, but it is the key to where you are going.
Yeah.
If you start short-circuiting workers' democracy, there is a danger that the cadres start to rely on themselves and their trusted party members and to begin to mistrust the democratic impulses of the masses. And this is a mortal danger for the revolution. I think she was really on point on that caution. I think we know that, of course, there is a huge gulf between Stalin's rule and the early years of the Russian Revolution. Of course there is. There's a reason Stalin had to execute or imprison virtually every member of the Bolshevik Central Committee, for instance. He had to transform the party into something it wasn't. However, I think we also need to say that the decline of the Soviets, the workers' councils, the decline of independent working class self-organization made it easier for Stalin to consolidate a new kind of dictatorial power.
Right.
And for that reason, Rosa's democratic cautions, I think, resonate very powerfully today when we look back on the revolution. And the great strength, and Priyansh, this sort of goes back to your point earlier, the great strength is her insistence that the masses are the bedrock. Socialism means their rule or it means nothing. There's this lovely passage where she says, socialist democracy is not a Christmas present we give to the masses somewhere down the road.
Yeah.
Socialist democracy is the process of the construction of the new society.
Right.
And I think that is maybe the greatest part of her inheritance when we think about our project going forward.
Okay. That's fantastic. That's fantastic. Thank you so much, David. This was absolutely wonderful.
It's my pleasure. It's wonderful talking to you, comrades.
Yeah. And sorry, go on.
No, you go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just said that just to wrap up, I think one of the two things that I really got out of this conversation, and I think which are also important in our segue to Lenin over the next couple of episodes of this, is that one, as to how Rosa and others in that milieu on the anti-imperialist, anti-war left, the European left at the time, are thinking about Marx and Marxism as a living tradition, right? So as an active translation. And an active translation, interestingly, I was reading the other day that the root of the word translation in Latin is the same as the root of the same root, Latin root, gives rise to translation, trader, and traitor. So in a sense, when you have to translate something to a different context, to a different language both lexically and politically, there's always a sense of betrayal to it. So in a sense, to be orthodox, you have to be unorthodox. To be fidelis, you have to do some infidelity. So that is, I think, one thing, and that is how living traditions work rather than fossilized traditions work. And the other thing which I really got out of this, and which will actually be very interesting, when we go to Lenin and his work and his, when he's thinking about state and revolution, dual power, is this fact of dual power of the self-organization and the self-transformation of subaltern, working class, and oppressed subjects. So I think if I may take the liberty of summing it all up, is that if we have to take two things out of the David's excellent discussion of Rosa today, is that one, this point of it being a living tradition, and the other is that of the ultimate aim is not simply to get hold of state power, which is it always is, but the ultimate aim is the self-organization and the creativity and the efflorescence of the creativity and self-capacity of ordinary people. And this is I think what the Paris Commune did. This is what the Barcelona did. This is what for some points of time Hungary and Bavarian revolutions did, and we find these examples in many parts of the world: Cuba, Vietnam, China, Russia, and so on and so forth. So I think with that we can thank David and wrap this up for today. We will hopefully have Urdu subtitles to this, so it will take a few days for it to come out, but we'll have it soon. And then in the next couple of programs, we'll segue into Lenin, perhaps the greatest, most innovative political thinker and practitioner of the last 150, 200 years. Thank you so much, David and Priyansh.